Begin Self-Publishing, episode number 8. Other self-publishing podcasts.
Interested in self-publishing but don't know where to start? Want to get your book onto Amazon? Want to hold your paperback book in your hands? Learn how on the Begin Self-Publishing podcast with your host, Tim Lewis.
It's going to be a bit of a short episode this week. I'm going away for a large chunk of this week, so I haven't had time to prepare a full long episode. However, I thought it might be useful to give you some idea of the other self-publishing podcasts that I listen to. It may be that you've come from those other podcasts, or you already listen to them, or it may be the case that you've never heard of any of them. Like with anything in life, the whole thing is to pick and choose those, see which you like, what format you like, and stick with them. The first podcast I'm going to mention is a self-publishing podcast. This was actually the first ever podcast I ever listened to. As I mentioned in a previous show, I read the book Write, Publish, Repeat by David Wright, Sean Platt, and Johnny B. Trune. In that book, they mention the fact that they're the hosts of the self-publishing podcast. I'd vaguely heard of the concept of podcasts before. I very almost didn't start listening to podcasts at all. However, as I was waiting for my company to be set up, I had a period of a few weeks where I wasn't able to do very much. It was an issue with the bank account. So I downloaded the podcast app on my iPhone and typed in the self-publishing podcast and started to listen to their show. There are some things to be aware of with the self-publishing podcast. The main thing is that it's not what you would call safe for work. The language used in the show can be pretty strong. Nothing that most people wouldn't necessarily have dealt with, but not suitable for young or even slightly older children. There's a lot of swearing and plain language. It's generally speaking an interview-based podcast. So they'll have a little bit of a period of chat at the beginning, and then they'll bring on somebody to interview them to talk about a self-publishing topic. I know they're in the process of rebranding the show, but I presume it's going to be very similar to this going forward. Generally speaking, it tends to be more advanced topics that they talk about. All the people on the show have got great personalities, and it's worth listening to it a few times to see whether you like it or not. The next podcast in the self-publishing realm that I moved on to is one called The Creative Pen. This is run by Joanna Penn, who is an expert in the self-publishing arena. She started off as a non-fiction self-published author, selling career and other advice, and now she's moved into becoming a fiction author as JF Penn. Again, her show is mostly interview-based, but it is a clean podcast, and she started to do more question and answer shows occasionally. Tends to be a bit more cerebral than the self-publishing podcast. Joanna usually runs very good shows with her guests. They tend to be more literary based than the self-publishing podcast side of things. She seems to be very interested in new technology and virtual reality especially. And also has a lot of episodes to do with film rights and other more high-level topics in self-publishing. The next show that I ended up listening to on the self-publishing area was one called the Rockin' Self-Publishing Podcast. This is run by a guy called Simon Whistler, who started out as an audio narrator for audiobooks. He's got an extremely good interview manner and is very good on audio. He doesn't necessarily come from the perspective of being a self-published author, even though now he is in the non-fiction realm. He's written an extremely good book about recording audiobooks, because he knows a lot about it, having been an audio narrator for several years. His show is also interview-based, where he interviews various self-published authors and talks to them about their craft. This can be very interesting to learn about the marketing side of the business. The fourth show I listen to on a regular basis is the Sell More Books show. This is a show by Jim Cockrell and Brian Cohen. Jim Cockrell is somebody who's from a more marketing, non-fiction background. He's a kind of plays the role of a wily old pro. Well, Brian Cohen is more from the fiction-based side of things. And they work as quite a good team together on the show. Their show is not generally interview-based, but is more goes through the news in the self-publishing area every week, which makes it quite different from the other shows. A recently new introduced podcast is the Author Strong podcast by Matt Morris. Unlike the other shows, which are weekly, this is a daily show. It's a mixture of interviews, which can be split up across multiple episodes, and also tutorials where he runs through with his fellow author Nancy, who's just starting out, through the process of becoming a self-published author. If you can cope with a daily show, then this is a good show to listen to. It may be the situation as I have with some of the daily shows that I subscribe to, where I just look at the episode and delete it if I don't like the look of it. A show I used to listen to, which doesn't seem to be on iTunes but I believe is still going, it's the Self-Publishing Roundtable. This is where a group of authors, usually 3 or 4, sit and interview somebody on a Google Hangout. I believe this is still going, though it's been on my subscribed list on iTunes for a while and I haven't seen a new episode. These are the podcasts that I have on my subscription on iTunes to do with self-publishing. I also listen to loads of other podcasts. I'm a bit of a podcast junkie. I've had up to 50 podcasts that I've subscribed to on a weekly basis. Times I do find it hard to keep up with everything, and I do end up deleting the odd episode here and there. If you know any other good self-publishing podcasts, then please let me know in the show notes on the beginselfpublishings.com site for this episode. I'll also include in those show notes links to all of these podcasts. Or you can just go into iTunes and type in the name of them. Apart from the Self-Publishing Roundtable, which seems to be a bit behind on iTunes at the moment. Hopefully they'll resolve that soon.
You're listening to the Begin Self-Publishing Podcast with Tim Lewis.
If you are interested in podcasting or learning how to do it, I've got a special discount code for you if you're interested in taking the same beginning podcasting course that I took, which is Cliff Ravenscraft's Podcasting A to Z course. Cliff is a guy who's been doing podcasting for 10 years and is known as the Podcast Answer Man and runs a podcast of the same name. He's taught all sorts of major people in the podcasting world how to podcast. While his course isn't cheap, he gives you 4 weeks of his time in the Podcasting A to Z course to teach you how to podcast. And it's an extremely patient and knowledgeable person about podcasting. If you want to get $500 off his next Podcasting A to Z course, then you can use the code Lewis500. If you book using that code, it will get you $500 off his course. I will get a commission from this using that code. Helps me out and it helps you out. Now, like with all things in life, you can work out how to podcast on your own without spending any money. But if this is something you're interested in and you feel you need coaching into how to podcast properly, and there are a lot of things you can get wrong, and this course is worth considering. If you're interested, go to the podcastingatoz.com site. I'll put this in the show notes, so you can also find it there. So that's all for this week. Sorry for the short episode, but I thought it was better to try and keep releasing weekly episodes rather than letting one slide just because I happen to be away for most of this week. Not entirely sure what next week's episode is going to be about. I may eventually get round to publishing something on Smashwords, so I can tell you about that. Or it may be something completely different. Talk to you guys next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please stop by iTunes and rate and leave a review. This helps make the show more visible. For free resources, show notes, and other helpful content, join the community at beginselfpublishing.com.